Hey y'all, welcome to Youth Empowerment and Restorative Justice. This is the pre-session learning, and we're going to cover some basic ideas that we want to dive a little deeper in when we hold the workshop. My name is Griffen Castillo, and I'll be holding this space with you all, hopefully. If not, nice to see you. I'm from Oakland, California, which is unceded Chochenyo Ohlone land. I'm currently a student at San Francisco State University, go Gators, and I'm a restorative and racial justice trainer in the Oakland Unified School District. And I think most importantly, I always want to share that I'm constantly learning and relearning how to live in circle, right? I don't have all the answers and I'm not perfect as well. We're in this journey together. And one of the things that I want to cover before we get into the workshop together and have discussion is the ladder of student involvement in schools. But before we even start talking about that, I want to shift that name in the way that we think about youth rather than things to be managed or lifted up, but as partners, right? So I want us to think about how we can empower youth through engaging with them and being good models for them. And we'll go over the rungs a little bit later on, but I want to name that in this process and in this ladder, it cannot apply to everybody at once, and it's not a set thing. Depending on certain individuals and certain times, you could be at different places on the ladder, right? Within the span of 10 minutes even, I could be manipulating. And then within a little bit later, I can be in equity with somebody, right? This ladder is not an end all and be all of the process, but rather a tool for you to gauge where you are and to gauge where systems are and how you're engaging with youth so that you can continue to strive for equity and empowering our young people. And let's go into the rungs now. The first rung is manipulation, right? This is when young people are forced to attend things without regard to the interest. This could be school, this could be meetings, but whatever it is, adults are in entire control and young people have no say in the matter. The second matter is when youth are present and invited, right? They say that they can come if they would like to, but they're not actually engaged, right? And this is similar to the third one, which is tokenism. And this is when young people are invited, but their voice is only used to reinforce the perception that young people are engaged. This is when young people are asked to speak or sit on something, but they're not actually a part of it. And their voice doesn't actually make a difference and isn't heard, but it's there for the sake of them saying that they are engaging with youth, right? I want to be clear that the first three are not engaging. This is not inspiring our young people to step into these spaces more. It's using them and taking advantage of them, right? And let's move on now to partial engagement. Youth informed, the fourth rung of this ladder. This looks like young people informing adults. This could look like focus groups or adults reaching out or asking students what they think. But the key piece here is that adults do not have to let young people impact their decisions, right? Adults are still in control of the process and get to decide how much and how little youth voices acknowledged and recognized and brought into the process, whatever that process may be. The fifth one, which is again still partial engagement, but a step up, is youth consulted, right? And this is when adults are actively consulting with young people, but they only have the agency that adults grant them, right? And going from youth informed to youth consulted, youth are brought in more, right? Rather than a focus group or a question, youth are able to be there throughout the process. But again, they only have the agency that adults will grant them, right? And then let's move on to what real engagement looks like and what is empowering and inspiring our young people. The first one we have is youth adult equity, right? This is when we really start partnering with our youth and telling them that they are valid and they're powerful and that we respect them and honor their voices, right? And it's hard, but this one looks like responsibilities, authority, obligations, and commitments being split equally between youth and adults. It's an intentional effort for adults and youth to say that we are equals and that we can both achieve things. So we share the burden of whatever it is that we're doing, right? And then from there, right, another important shift is a completely youth-driven process, right? Where young people are in total control of the process and adults are in secondary roles to support the youth, right? And this one's really uncomfortable because for a lot of adults, it's not easy to step back and say, I'm going to let my young people lead. But this is really important, right? When we talk about disrupting narratives and status quos or paradigms, this is a critical piece of it, right? Rather than adults being on the top and students being behind or a passive role, we flip that. And it's an important exercise and necessary step to achieving what we really want, which is youth-adult equity. For those of you who don't know, equity is when people are met and supported wherever they are. And the reason that this is at the top of our ladder is because youth and adults have different skill sets and different powers and different wisdom, right? Young people know things that adults don't know. And on that hand, adults know things that young people don't know. And they both have access to resources that the other does not, right? So youth adult equity is when youth, young adults, and adults are all recognized for impact, value, and wisdom, and they support each other in the process. They don't say that you have to do these things. They ask, how can we all support each other, right? And we'll have more opportunity. I know you're thinking a lot right now, but we'll have more opportunity when we join the workshop to dive a little deeper into this and have a more robust conversation around what it means and what it looks like. And I want to dive a little bit deeper because, like I shared, they're not all good and bad, and they can't describe every part of a school at once, right? And so these are from freechild.org, which I recommend you check out. They're a great organization, and they have a great website with plenty of interesting articles that can really shift the way that you think about how we engage with youth, right? So, for example, there's challenges and rewards to all of these things. Let's dive into that on each of these levels. So, for manipulation, right? The challenge is and the struggle is that young people are forced to attend without regard to their interest. But the benefit is that adults experience involving young people and gain rationale for continued activities, right? Even though we don't want to be manipulating our students, it means that adults get to work that muscle of bringing students in, right? Even if it's not the best way to do it. And then for decoration, right? When we think that the presence that young people being in the space is all that's necessary without actually engaging with them, again, not where we want to be, but there's still benefits to these things, right? There's always that silver lining. I know it's cliche, but bear with me. But when students are used as decoration, the attendance by youth and young people is a tangible outcome that may demonstrate consideration for engaging young people, right? Again, it's not exactly a fair, equitable process, but it means that young people are in this space. It means that adults are seeing young people, and it's normalizing that process, right? And then from here we have tokenism, right? This idea that young people are not important and they're only used to reinforce the idea that they're engaged. Um, and again, this is not where we want to be, but what it does is that it validates youth and young adults attending these events without requiring effort beyond that. For many young people or young adults, it can be scary or intimidating to step into new spaces, right? And so what this does is it allows students to see that they can be in these spaces and that they have a right to be in these spaces as well, right? And again, this is non-engagement. These are not engaging things, but there's still benefits to them. And again, nothing is bad. We're all in different places, and thinking about the bright side means that we can think about how we can continue to move forward and continue this process of engaging and empowering our young people. Now let's talk about that partial engagement, right? When youth are informed, when young people are informing adults on decision making. And again, this means that adults do not have to let young people impact their decisions, but it also means that young people can influence adult-driven decisions or activities. That's also important here because youth are actually being listened to. And that's an important distinction from the previous ones where youth are not actually being listened to or heard, but only tokens or decoration. And then from then we have the youth consulted piece, where adults are actively consulting young people while they're involved. And again, this means that young people only have the authority that adults grant them, but it also means that young people can substantially transform adults' opinions, ideas, and actions, right? When you're working closely together and actually listening to your young people that you work with, it means that the young people have an opportunity to voice their opinions and their needs, which is something they don't always have, right? And let's dive in a little bit more to what engagement looks like, right? When we're really empowering our young people. So let's start off with the whole idea of youth-adult equality, where there's a direct 50-50 split in responsibilities, authorities, obligations, and commitment, right? The struggle here is that there isn't recognition for the specific developmental needs or representation opportunities for young people. Without receiving that recognition, young people may lose interest and become disengaged, right? If we say that young people are now adults and give them all of the responsibilities that adults have, we don't acknowledge how precious it is to have young people in this space, right? This doesn't mean that adults should do more than young people. It just means that we need to figure out different things to do. And again, similar to the last one, but the reward of this piece is that young people can again substantially and significantly transform adults' opinions, ideas, and actions. If we're seen as equals, then my voice should and could also be equal to yours as an adult, right? And that's an amazing thing as a young person to hear and to realize. And then the next one, right? Completely youth-driven action. And these activities do not include adults in position of authority, but adults are supporting the students. And again, the struggle here is always a struggle and there's always a reward no matter what we're doing. But the struggle here is that young people may operate in a vacuum, right? Often without understanding their impact on the larger community. Yeah, and the reward again is developing that complete ownership in communities, allows young people to effectively drive community engagement. Young people experience the outcomes of their direct actions on themselves, their peers, in the larger community, right? This step of completely youth-driven action gives youth the idea that they can do things and that they can make amazing changes in their community, right? And that's a huge reward. And then finally, where we want to be going, where our goal is, youth-adult equity, where all youth, young adults, and older adults are recognized for the impact and ownership of their outcomes, right? And this is a hard piece. The challenge here is that it requires conscious commitment by all parties, right? You have to deliberately name the struggles of what it means to be a young person in an adult world and ensure shared outcomes. It takes a lot of collaboration and intention, right? It's not an easy step to get to. And then the reward is that it creates structure that establishes and supports safe, supportive, effective, and sustainable environments for engagement, and ultimately recreates the climate and culture of organizations and communities. This is where we want to be going, right? As a young person, to be in a safe, supportive, effective, and sustainable environment is an amazing thing to have. And thinking back to when we were young people, we may not have had those. And if we did, how did it impact us, right? We'll have opportunities to discuss it more in the workshop, but this is where we want to be going. And this might sound familiar to some of you, and that's because it is. That's a very similar goal to what we do in restorative justice spaces, right? As David Ryan Castro Harris shares, the founder of Amplify RJ, restorative justice is a philosophy and set of practices rooted in indigenous teachings that emphasize our interconnection by repairing relationships when harm occurs, while proactively building and maintaining relationships to prevent future harm, right? It's about building relationships. And when we're in an equitable partnership with our youth, we're building those relationships and we prevent future harms, right? It doesn't mean that we're adults and we tell them what to do and they don't have power. We build them up and heal, right? And so what I want to dive into a little bit is the restorative justice tree, but more the roots and the mindset and the values and how that gives life and really shapes the way that we engage with the world. And specifically in this context, how it can shape and guide the way that we engage with youth. So let's talk about that. In restorative justice spaces, these 7 core assumptions, these ideas that the true self in everyone is good, wise, and powerful, that the world is profoundly interconnected, that all human beings have a deep desire to be in a good relationship, that all humans have gifts, and that everyone is needed for what they bring, that everything we need to make positive change is already here, that human beings are holistic, and that we need practices to build habits of living from the core self, right? These are taken from indigenous teachings and other wisdom traditions, but this specific list is taken from Heart of Hope and Circle Forward by Carolyn Boyes Watson and Kay Prentice. But then from these mindsets, right, from these core assumptions and from these values, we get these values, right, of equity, of respect, of compassion, of the capacity to hold multiple truths, of interconnection, of indigenous roots and self-determination as well, right? And so thinking about the parallels here, right, how do we engage this way with our youth? How do we respond to them equitably? How do we respect them? How do we show compassion? How do we allow them to be true? How do we prove and not even prove, but acknowledge and respect that interconnection, acknowledge all of our indigenous roots, and acknowledge self-determination as well, and give youth space to choose what they want to be doing, right? And then furthermore, that question at the bottom, what are yours? What values do you need to be held up? And how can you share that with the young people that you work with? And the important part of this tree is that it's a process, right? And like any process, there's steps to it, and it continues, and it's never over. So for you to engage and for us to engage young people at one point in the process is not enough. It's not, it's the whole idea that doing one anti-racist action does not make you anti-racist. Engaging youth once does not mean that you're engaged with youth. It's a constant effort, right? So when we talk about the restorative justice tree and how the mindset leads to the trunk, which leads to the branches, which leads to the fruit, right? We talked about the roots and how those mindsets can guide us in our work with youth. Let's talk about the trunk, right? And how it can support the rest of the tree. The trunk in restorative practices looks like talking circles, looks like communication for connection, checking in, collaborative agreements, and looks like self-care and internal work as well, which is a hard one, I know. But again, thinking about how we can engage with youth in this way. How do we let youth lead talking circles and talk about things that matter to them? How do we communicate more than just school or assignments, but ask them how they're doing? How do we check in genuinely and compassionately? How do we collaborate on agreements and norms and values and courtesies? And how do we take care of ourselves so that we can take care of each other? That one's a tricky one, but when you take care of yourself as somebody in space with others, it means that it's okay for them to as well. And it means that they can look to you a lot of the time for advice and as a role model in taking care of themselves. And then from the trunk, we have these branches, right? And we have the mindsets of understanding that all human beings are good and valuable. And you don't have to agree with that, but that's what we hold to be true. And from there, we have these communication for connection and compassion because we know it's true and because we know that when people are met with compassion, they have the opportunity to be the good people that they are. And the trunk gives life to the branches. And the branches is the restorative justice processes, right? The restorative conversations, the restorative circles, the restorative conferences. And then the processing questions, right? What happened? Who's affected and how? And what needs must be met to make this right? And again, we want to talk about youth empowerment and restorative justice. How do we make this process critical to our young people? How do we engage them in restorative conversations? How do we hold restorative circles? How do we hold restorative conferences? And how do we support them so that they can hold it themselves? So that when they leave the spaces that we hold, that they have the capacity and the tools to heal their own community because they need to, right? And because our job as educators, as people, as elders, is to support them in their growth and to give them tools that we needed when we were younger, right? And from these, we have these restorative outcomes. And I want to think about our youth in this space, right? When we're engaging with our youth in an equitable way and partnering with them rather than doing things for them, we have healing, we deepen our relationships, we acknowledge the harm we cause, we can shift our behavior, and we can build skills, right? And so our young people thriving and our young people being joyful and empowered is the leaves and the fruit of this, right? And the leaves feed the tree. It supports the process. When you have youth that are understanding and appreciative of this process, they understand how valuable it is and give back to it. I choose to come back and work in the school district that I'm from, not because of money, but because of the opportunities that I had, because I was lucky enough to be empowered as a youth as well. And the fruits feed the animals and the community around it. And even if our kids and even if our young people don't choose to come back to our tree, they have the tools to feed other communities and to grow new trees as well, right? And that's it for this, but I want you all to think about this before we come into the workshop together, but how are we engaging with youth and how can we use this ladder? Feel free to go back and look over it as much as you can. How can we use this ladder as a tool to check ourselves when we're engaging with youth? And with that, I'll see you all soon. And I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you are taking things away already. And I look forward to holding conversation with you all. Peace.